Let me begin by saying, obviously, this is a question that people throw at Christianity. This is a question that people throw at the Bible. But it's also a question that is thrown from the pages of the Bible itself. Whether you're looking at the book of Job, or you're reading through the Psalms, or even Jesus' passion quoting from the Psalms, my God, why have you forsaken?" This is a question that does not take Christianity, it doesn't take Jesus by surprise. For example, if we were to look at John chapter 11, we'd read about Lazarus. Lazarus, the friend of Jesus, the one whom Jesus loves. And Lazarus is sick. And Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, they send off a message to Jesus. No, they probably didn't do it like that, did they? It's probably an email. Anyway, so they sent a message to Jesus, pigeon mail, who knows? But Jesus gets the message, right? What does he do? He delays. He doesn't come straight away. Meanwhile, Mary and Martha are sitting by the bedside of Lazarus, watching this sickness consume him until eventually it overtakes him in his suffering and he dies. And Jesus, who loved him, didn't come. Jesus wasn't there. I pick up the story from verse 32 in John chapter 11, and it says, "When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, 'Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died.' When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. 'Where have you laid him?' he asked. 'Come and see, Lord,' they replied. Jesus wept. And then the Jews said, 'See how he loved him.' But some of them said, 'Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man also from dying?'" You see, the natural response of Mary and Martha and other friends and family was to ask, "Lord, where were you? Why didn't you show up and do something? You've got the power to stop this sort of thing. Why didn't you come? Don't you even care?" And I wonder if you've ever asked God a question like that. First time I ever asked God a question like that was when I was sitting beside the bed of someone that I loved. My grandmother, she was racked with pain. And I'm sitting there wondering, why would God allow what seemed to me such a needlessly cruel and slow and tragic and early death for my grandmother? We shouldn't be surprised if, like Mary and Martha, we find ourselves asking these sort of questions in response to suffering. And what is Jesus' response to Mary? Well, it's neither a response of anger at her questioning, nor is it a response of disinterest in her suffering. We read in verse 35, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. The God of the Bible is not immune to your suffering or mine. He's clearly moved by it. In fact, one of the Psalms paints a beautiful picture of God as the one who holds all our tears in a bottle. Every single one of our tears matters to God. God really cares. Now, suffering can test our faith in God's goodness. As human beings, we're tempted to think that if we were God, well, we would just get rid of suffering altogether. Wouldn't we? We'd just get rid of suffering. So why doesn't God just get rid of suffering? But I wonder, would we really want to get rid of suffering if we could see the whole picture like God sees the picture? We know, for example, that some suffering is actually good. Suffering helps us to develop compassion and understanding for other people. They say the best doctors are the doctors who have been through the same illness and operation that they're looking after the patient with right now. When we think about people we admire who've got to places of great achievement, the ones that we really admire are the ones who've had to work at it with blood and sweat and tears, and not the people for whom everything in life just comes easily, because we know that suffering produces character, and that a pain-free life actually stunts our character. The writer John Elridge said, "I don't trust a man who hasn't suffered." I don't trust a man who hasn't suffered. Suffering also causes many to seriously consider God's existence, often for the first time. The contemporary French philosopher Luc Ferry said that tragedy and heartbreak and suffering, more than anything else in this life, inclines us to consider whether in fact there is more to life than just this life, whether in fact there is a God. Suffering in a way forces us to think, what is this life actually all about? So clearly, not all suffering is bad. A friend of mine grew up in Nepal. His parents were doctors, missionary doctors to people who suffered from leprosy. And he explained to me that leprosy is caused by a bacteria that destroys nerve endings such that a person loses the ability to feel any pain. And he said that the deformities that they experience in hands and in their feet is not caused by the leprosy, but it's caused by the result of a person being unable to experience pain and suffering. And so they persistently experience injuries. They stub their toe again and again without realizing. They put their hand in the fire without realizing. In the West, we're accustomed to think of pain and suffering as our greatest enemies, because we're accustomed to thinking of pain minimization and pleasure maximization as life's greatest goals and ultimate goodness. And because we're conditioned to think of goodness through this lens of pain minimization and pleasure maximization, we conclude that if God exists, he should create a world without pain and without suffering. But if God did decide to create a world without pain and without suffering, where would that leave you and where would that leave me? I don't mean, would it leave us better off or worse off? I mean, would it leave us existing at all? If God created a world without evil and without suffering, would we even be in that world? Asking for a world without hurt is asking for a world without people who never cause hurt, who never cause others pain. And if we're honest, that's not us. At least it's not me. Sometimes I'm selfish, and sometimes in my selfishness I cause others pain. God could create a world without evil and suffering by populating this world with automatons, with robots who always do the right thing because that is what they've been programmed by God to do. But such a world as this, though it may be free of pain and free of evil, allows no space for love. For in order for there to be love, there must be genuine freedom of choice. Because love that is not freely given is not truly love. The Bible tells us that God didn't choose automatons, he chose us. He chose us. He chose love. And the life and the freedom that God gave us to choose love, we've used to reject God's love and his goodness. And our relationships have fractured as a result. Our relationship with God, with others, with the natural world, and even with ourselves, we're broken. We're morally, relationally, and spiritually broken. And we see this evidence of brokenness in our lives and in our newspapers every day. But the Bible also tells us that God hasn't just watched on from a distance, leaving us in our brokenness and in our mess. The Bible tells us that God so loved you and loved me that he sent his only son, Jesus, into this world. God bodily entered into our suffering, experienced what it is to be cold and hungry and tired, to be betrayed, rejected, to be humiliated, to be tortured and to be ultimately killed. Of all the major responses to suffering, this is utterly unique. Jesus Christ is absolutely unique. For example, in Islam, one is taught that Allah is pulling all the strings from way up high and human beings have no free will. Therefore, everything that happens is Allah's will, and since suffering happens, all suffering is Allah's will, and since all suffering is Allah's will, we must not question it, we must only submit and accept it. Classic Hinduism teaches that karma and the caste system, that whatever is happening to you because you deserve what's happening to you. And if you're born into the lowest of the low, the untouchables, then you are exactly where you deserve to be. Now, Buddha rejected the caste system. He rejected suffering as well. Not by saying it's wrong, but by saying it's not even real. Buddhism teaches that our suffering is only an illusion. Now, if you're an atheist like Richard Dawkins, then suffering is neither right nor wrong, just or unjust. It's just bad luck. If you're an atheist, says Dawkins, then this universe has at bottom no design and no purpose and no evil and no good. It's just nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. In other words, lion eats lamb and wolf eats sheep, and that's just the way life goes. In fact, some atheist philosophers have even suggested that that's the way life ought to be, including in human relationships, that the strong ought to dominate the weak, and suffering is nature's way of weeding out the weak and helping us humans to evolve. So you can see when it comes to the question of suffering, there's some very different explanations on offer. On the question of suffering, as on almost every question, one finds that the religions are not all the same. They're very, very different. And you can see that the differences make a difference. Christianity doesn't say that suffering is just natural, so go with it. It doesn't say that suffering is just bad luck, so deal with it. It doesn't say that suffering is just an illusion, so ignore it. And it doesn't say that suffering is just God's will, so accept it. Don't question it. Christianity does not deny, nor does it diminish the reality of evil and suffering. Rather, it affirms your deepest instinct that the way that this world is not the way that the world should be. It allows us to name evil for what it is. It takes evil and suffering very seriously. That's why at the center of Christianity, there is a cross. And on that crucifix, there is a man, a body, broken and bleeding for you and for me. When C.S. Lewis, the renowned Christian writer from Northern Ireland and the author of the famous Narnia series, when this great writer was just a boy, tragically he lost his mother to cancer and he moved to atheism. But he said that as a young atheist, he was living in a world of contradictions. He said, as a young man, I maintained that God did not exist. I was also very angry with God for not existing. And I was equally angry with God for creating such a world as this. The simple truth is suffering doesn't get any easier by getting rid of God. It's not the answer. In the midst of suffering, we don't need a better philosophy. We don't even need a better religion. We need a friend. We need a friend who loves us, who understands us completely, who knows what we're going through, and who has experienced pain and rejection and suffering and grief. Someone that we know is completely for us, who will never leave us and never forsake us. And Jesus Christ offers you and me exactly that sort of friendship. A friendship that is so profound, so deep, and so lasting that even the worst things in this world cannot take away from us joy and meaning that can be found in this friendship. And every single one of us is hungry for a connection like that. Now, we wrongly think, oh yeah, I know what my problem is. My problem is I'm limited. I can't stop bad things happening, or I can't get the things that I want happening in my life. That's my problem. But from God's perspective, your biggest problem is not limitation, it's isolation. The Bible says we are disconnected. We've disconnected from God, and we're disconnected from each other, and we're disconnected even from ourselves. So in the Bible, when God's people are about to go through a really difficult time, God often encourages them with this phrase. He says, "Fear not." But he doesn't say, "Fear not, for I will remove your limitations." He says, "Fear not, for I will be with you." I remember being with my daughter, Grace, and taking her to hospital as an 18-month-old to get her needles, her immunization. And let me tell you, as a parent, this is an absolutely horrendous experience. What you have to do is sit there with the person that you love so much at the tender age of 18 months, and you have to hold their arm while a rather sinister-looking nurse with a giant foot-long needle goes up and sticks that needle into your loved one's arm. My wife wonderfully said to me, "It's your job." So I did what I was told, and I took my daughter Grace there. And I remember looking at her face and thinking, what is she going to think when she sees that her daddy, who loves her, is allowing this evil nurse to stick the needle into her arm? And I remember looking at my daughter's face, looking at this nurse who she thought was lovely, looking at the shiny metal object which she thought might be a toy, and looking at me saying, "Daddy, you're just amazing." And I'm looking at her face and then holding her arm as the nurse sticks the needle in. First shock. And then the blood rushes to her face. The tears pour out. And I'm looking at her face. And as a dad, this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking to see whether in her face I can perceive that she would experience any doubt that I still love her. Now, thankfully, I did not see anything in her face that suggests that she thought that I didn't love her. But what I did see was this one question. Can you guess what the question was? Why? Why are you allowing this to happen to me, God, given that I know, sorry, Dad, delusions of grandeur, given that I know that you love me, why are you allowing this to happen? And the reality is, she was not yet of an age where I could have actually explained to her the good reasons for why I was allowing this to happen. But I did know that one day she would understand, but right now, in this moment, she couldn't. She wasn't capable. All she had was trust. That's it. Trust in my love for her. But it was a trust based on the evidence of my love for her from the very first day of her life, and it was a solid trust. As a child of God, I've learned to trust that God has good reasons for the things that He allows, even if I recognize that in this life I might not ever be able to understand the complexity of the big picture and really know why God allowed this or that to happen in my life. But one thing I can know is that I can trust Him. When the author Dostoevsky was staring at a painting of Jesus Christ, he was struck by this truth that no other God has scars. No other God has scars. The cross is God's answer to a hurting world. And just as the cross reminds us that this world is not the way that it should be, so too the resurrection is a promise that one day this world will be restored to what it should be. In the passage in John 11, we see that though Jesus loved Lazarus, He didn't prevent Lazarus from suffering. He didn't prevent Lazarus from dying. But we who sit on the other side of the story know that Jesus does eventually raise Lazarus back to life. Similarly, Jesus doesn't promise to shield us from all of the suffering and death involved in this fallen life. But He does promise that one day there will be no more tears. He does promise that one day the sting of suffering will be removed. One day life will swallow up death, and joy will swallow up sadness. One day, all that is wrong, He is able to put right. And one day, everything that is sad is going to come untrue. But in the meantime, in the now, Jesus calls you and He calls me to trust Him. Sometimes, even in the midst of suffering so terrible, that we cannot help ourselves but cry out to God in frustration and tears. But even then, we can still trust Him. Not only because, let's face it, where else in the universe have we to go? But also because the one who promises to be with us in our suffering is worthy of all our trust. And He's got the scars to prove it.